Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Ros Taylor. On today's show, we're talking about the Israel-Hamas war. How much sway do the US and UK really have? And who do we trust to tell us about what's happening? It's terrifying, but we need to take the prospect of a Trump second term seriously. What would it be like? And is Europe ready? And in the extra bit for Patreon backers, a group of MEPs were sent to Disneyland after their train was redirected. What unexpected adventures have the panel been on? Let's meet that panel. Rachel Cunliffe is Associate Political Editor at The New Statesman. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
By the time many listeners hear this podcast, we'll know the result of the Mid-Bedfordshire and Tamworth by-elections. You've been talking to people in Mid-Beds, haven't you? What did they say?
It was really interesting. I went up and joined the Liberal Democrats and the Labour team canvassing, tried to speak to the Conservative candidate, was told he didn't have time. Real anger on the doorstep about Nadine Dorries, specifically, the Conservative MP who's standing down, but also about the fact that they just feel that they've been taken for granted. This is a constituency that's been Conservative for nearly 100 years. Most of the people that we talked to said that they'd never been canvassed before. They'd never had this much attention. I got some great quotes about Nadine Dorries. As much use as a chocolate fireplace was my favourite. One guy said he was looking forward to the opportunity to stick two fingers up. But really, the story of that by-election, obviously we'll have the results by the time people are listening to this, is it's one of the few genuine three-way races in the UK, and you've got a majority of over 24,000 that Labour and the Lib Dems are trying to overturn, and the split of that could be really interesting and could tell us a lot about opportunities for tactical voting, or whether those the talk of tactical voting is in fact a pipe dream when it comes to the general election. So it's a really interesting one to watch, I think. And I also got to see where Nadine Dorries used to hold her constituency surgeries, but now it's a dance studio.
Because she doesn't hold them anymore.
She does not, or she hasn't for some time.
Gavin Esler is a former Newsnight presenter and author of Britain is Better Than This. Hello, Gavin.
Hello.
MI5 has been warning us about the scale of Chinese espionage in the UK. What are the Chinese trying to find out?
Everything, apparently. Ken McCallum, who's the director of MI5, says it's a sustained campaign on a pretty epic scale and 20,000 people have been approached. I don't know any of the details, but I do know quite a good story about a friend of mine who's an academic who was teaching a class in a university, and I won't say any details about it, but he'd got quite a few Chinese students. And he noticed that there was a new person who came into the class, a young woman, and he asked something about why was she there? And she said, she just was quite interested in this kind of subject, and maybe she could sit in. So she sat in, and he thought it was a bit funny. So he went to his professor afterwards and mentioned it to the head of department, rather, who said, oh, yeah, it's probably a spy. And he wasn't joking. And my friend said, that possibly explains why none of the students will talk about anything personal in the class or in public, or when asked to do certain things, they keep very strictly to business. So maybe they're not just spying on high tech, which is what MI5 says, and research establishments and so on, but they may also be spying on Chinese students in the United Kingdom.
Our guest this week is Associate Professor in Global Politics, writer for The Atlantic, and host of the podcast Power Corrupts. Brian Klaas, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Brian, what's the latest in the saga of the next House of Representatives Speaker? Because the Trump ally Jim Jordan has had a setback, hasn't he?
He has indeed. So basically, to recap, the fringe right in the Republican Party deposed Kevin McCarthy, who had a very difficult ride getting to become speaker in the first place and sort of cut deals with the far right. And then they turned on him. And now the candidate that's been put forward is Jim Jordan, who is an extremely far right person, sort of the insurrectionist in chief, as it were, within the Republican caucus, the person who was one of the main architects trying to overthrow the 2020 election in coordination with the Trump administration. A man who has never passed a bill in his entire time in Congress to be in charge of the House, and also a person who strongly favors a national abortion ban and has authored legislation to that extent. Now, he did not get past the initial hurdle, and so his candidacy looks like it might be dead in the water, but you never say never with crazy developments in the modern Republican Party, so we'll have to wait and see.
Do we have a sense of how long this is going to take?
No, we don't. I mean, basically, you need to have. There were something like 20 holdouts who voted against Jordan within the Republican caucus. Of course, the Democrats all voted against him. I don't think he's going to convert many of those people. So we'll see. I mean, it's not a particularly good time for the House of Representatives to not have a leader and not be able to conduct business. So this was a self-inflicted wound, and it's sort of lending itself to that moniker of the Chaos Caucus and suggesting that Republicans are very good at blocking things and very bad at governing.
As we record this, Joe Biden is visiting Israel. He was hoping to meet Arab leaders as well as the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, but the summit in Jordan was cancelled at the last minute. Meanwhile, hundreds of people are reported to have died in a strike on a Gaza hospital, and both sides are blaming the other for it. Biden has accepted Israel's version of events, which is that a Hamas rocket failed to launch properly. Gavin, in public, Biden's support for Israel's right to defend itself has been unwavering. But Israel's decision to cut off water, fuel and aid to Gaza is causing immense suffering. He and Netanyahu have known each other for 40 years. What will he be saying to Netanyahu in private, do you think?
I think the words in private are the most useful thing there, because in public he should hug a lot of people and offer his condolences and say how appalled he is personally, and we are as a society, with what has happened to people in the Jewish settlements and elsewhere. Privately, I think he should echo some of the things that have been said here by William Hague, for example, that Israel may be walking into a trap, both politically and diplomatically, and also on the ground. I mean, on the ground, the fighting will be very difficult if it really is fighting in an urban area which is partly destroyed. But the prospect of Israel creating more victims than have been created by Hamas in Israel is one which could rebound very seriously across the world. And I mean not just in the Arab world or not just in the Muslim world, but elsewhere too, making it very, very difficult for the United States to offer any kind of blank check. So Biden is obviously, as vice president and in his years in the Senate, he's got a lot of experience here, and he has got a lot of favors that he can call on, and he has got the big stick that America is the biggest supplier of arms and so on. Politically, of course, this is going to be very difficult for Netanyahu, because I mean it is quite clear that when we look beyond the immediate emergency, Netanyahu's conduct over the past year or two has not been helpful to anybody in the Middle East, including, unfortunately, the people of Israel.
Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, has been ringing round leaders in the region trying to persuade them not to escalate the conflict. And he's spoken of Britain's key role, as he sees it, in deterrence. How much credibility does Britain have in the region? Are we in any sense a player?
We're a player in one sense. I mean, we do have some military capacity, but I'll get onto that in a moment. But we're also a player in the sense that, the King of Jordan is very pro-British. The people from the leadership of the United Arab Emirates and other countries have often been educated in Britain, and many of them like this country very much. However, we do appear very much like the mouse that roars. I mean, Grant Shapps now, currently, I think his fifth job is Defence Secretary. He is completely unfit for that post. The idea that we are simultaneously cutting back the British Army to 72,000 people, which was last seen at the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1715, and then we're suggesting that we're somehow a significant power. We're not anymore, really. And so we can be part of a cheerleading group for perhaps some of the things that are going to happen diplomatically, but we're not. And we have some very competent diplomats who have access to the highest echelons of the Israeli government and elsewhere. But we're not really, we're not really a big player anymore in the Middle East, and we delude ourselves if we think we are.
Brian, there were protests in cities around the Middle East yesterday night after it was assumed that an Israeli strike had hit the hospital in Gaza. That's now, as I was saying, very much disputed. Hezbollah is already skirmishing with Israel on the Lebanese border. But how keen are governments in the Middle East to get involved in this?
I think not keen at all, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. Wars, especially fast-moving conflicts like this with an information space that is frankly out of control, toxic, and very, very difficult to understand in real time. amplifies the risk of miscalculation. And I think that what we're seeing right now is, protests that are sparked by social media videos, many of which are unverified, claims that are unverified, and so on. And so, I fear that this is one of those watershed moments. It was, Ukraine and the war with Russia has also been a testing ground for this, but it's sort of a choose your own reality information space where people are now able to just sort of pick what they want to believe and then act upon it. And then governments are responding in real time to those events, those protests that are sparked by things that may or may not be true. So you have, governments that are trying to walk a fine line diplomatically, but then as they're meeting, the events are changing on the ground based on what's happening on, Elon Musk's, Twitter zombie that is basically broken as a vector for reliable information. And this is the kind of thing where I think, again, anytime you look at the history of warfare, miscalculation is a central part of things going wrong. And that's what I'm most worried about is, people misreading the environment or the events based on false information, which I think is more dangerous than it's been in modern history.
Is public feeling in the US squarely behind Israel? Because traditionally it has been.
Yeah, Israel has been a longstanding U.S. ally, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, regardless of political events. That being said, there's been a splintering over events in Israel and in Gaza, with some elements of the far left much more prone to acting as apologists for Hamas. Some elements of the far right acting as though Palestinian lives do not matter at all. And, I think the consensus that exists in U.S. foreign policy is that this is something where the U.S. has a long-term strategic goal that backs Israel. And I think, Biden is squarely within that remit. So regardless of what the political fallout is from, sort of the next 12 months heading into the 2024 election, I don't think that a major geopolitical alignment realignment will happen. And I do think that, Biden would probably put more emphasis on civilian protection than Trump would if he was president at this moment. But I think there's a significant consensus in the center of American politics that U.S. backing for Israel is a long-term core strategic goal of the country.
Rachel, we've been talking about the information war and disinformation. I've lost count of the number of people I've seen casting shade on the BBC's coverage of the war, and that is on both sides. I don't remember a war where the narrative has been so constantly contested in real time. Does this feel like a dangerous place to be in?
It does. A couple of caveats on that. I am not unbiased in this. I have family currently in Israel. I also think that the job that foreign correspondents, particularly war correspondents, are doing is incredibly difficult, putting their own safety at risk to be in areas of high conflict and being exposed to the most horrific scenes and then trying to report on that in an impartial way. And I don't think we should underestimate the challenge there. In the last 24 hours, I have been quite disturbed by how the BBC and other news organisations chose to report on the strike on the hospital. And it's worth saying now, we still don't know exactly what happened. It's possible we will never know what happened, but the information that's come in today has been more leaning in the direction of it being a misfired Hamas rocket rather than an Israeli strike. The BBC and other media organisations put out a push notification immediately in real time that quoted the Hamas version of events, which was that it was an Israeli strike. And I think I watched that unfold on social media, and that has the potential to, I think, do a lot of damage because it suits some people's narrative. It's categorically in opposition to other people's narrative, who will then find it harder to trust information that comes from those news outlets. It escalates the tone of the discussion, as it were, as if it wasn't heightened enough. And it's very difficult when a claim like that has been made to then go back in subsequent days and say, actually, the evidence is now pointing towards something else. So I would hope that that particular experience, perhaps there are editors at those news organisations who look at how they reported on that news and might make different decisions next time around, because I do worry that it has real consequences.
Is there an organisation you do trust to cover it fully and fairly, or does this feel like, a just morass of potential misinformation and disinformation?
I would second what Brian has said in that I think the worst place to be following the news on this is social media platforms, particularly Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it now. And I have seen a number of videos purporting to be one thing posted by both sides that turn out to be old footage of something completely different. And the clarification gets far, far less attention than the initial post. As I said, I think foreign correspondents are doing an incredibly difficult job. And I think the coverage from the main outlets, the BBC, Sky, they've been doing their best in an incredibly challenging situation. I think maybe scaling back on news consumption and reading a range of sources and trying to stick to the main ones rather than the endless doom scrolling on Twitter that we've all been very familiar with is probably a better and more productive way to consume news about this. But it's incredibly difficult. And I say that after 7 days of doom scrolling on Twitter.
Yeah, I remember feeling the same way during COVID, though obviously a very different issue. Gavin, you're chairing a Media Society event on Thursday on the coverage. What is most concerning you about what's going on here?
I suppose what's most concerning me are the things that both Rachel and Brian have touched on, but I view it in a slightly different way. I mean, I started my career in Belfast, and there were some people who said, it's almost as if there are Protestant facts and Catholic facts, or Unionist facts and Nationalist facts, because people had different versions. But the big difference was that everything was much slower, because there wasn't the kind of live coverage that we have now, and the constant attempts at hot takes and what's really going on and why can't you tell us and all that sort of thing. So there's pressure both on the sources and pressure on the journalists, not just the fact that they might actually be killed doing their job. The obvious questions are, how do we get the facts out? But how do we share the facts while giving people two different versions, very, very different versions of what went wrong, when one of them is clearly wrong, but we still don't know exactly which one it is. And as Rachel said, 80% it looks like it was a Hamas misfired rocket, but it didn't particularly look like that this morning. So these issues are very, very difficult for journalists. How do we know that the facts are really facts? And I'm leaving out the doom scrolling on basically discredited social media platforms. Just even talking to people, what they see and what they have held, what has happened to them, and also what Israeli sources have said coming from the Israeli military. And when some journalists quote the Israeli military, there will be some viewers and listeners who will immediately say that's suspect. So it is a very, very difficult for our colleagues. And actually, I feel quite sorry for them. And I also wonder, what do we mean by balance anymore? I mean, how do you balance somebody who's telling the truth with somebody who is clearly telling a lie, but we don't know which one it is? So those are the basic issues. And the one other one is that, journalists, journalism in the United Kingdom and elsewhere seems at times like a very big beast, but it also seems at times that we've got a very small brain, because there's still a war going on in Ukraine and everybody is looking at the Middle East while that is happening. And simply resources mean, I suspect, if this goes on for a long time, we'll be undercovering what's going on in Ukraine, which I think would be unfortunate.
Brian, how does all this play into what you could call the new Cold War, with relations between the West and Russia and China so bad? How will it affect that dynamic?
Well, I think, it's very difficult to know over the long term, but I would say that the Russian and Chinese governments want anything that sort of weakens or splinters the West. So every single opportunity that they have to drive divides in Western political camps, they will exploit. And I think that's the prism through which they see a lot of global events. So, I think there will be attempts to try to find wedge issues between how the US responds to this versus the EU versus individual EU countries. So there's not unity within the EU and so on, in an attempt to try to create the sort of appearance of disarray or disunity. I think there's a lot that's happening very, very quickly. I mean, Joe Biden is deciding how to behave day to day because the events are shifting day to day. Obviously, the big picture is still backing Israel, but the degree to which the behind closed doors conversations are pushing more for humanitarian aid being let in and other things like that, those are all unfolding in real time. So I think these two major conflicts, the Ukraine and Israel-Gaza conflicts, are ones that are going to rejigger a lot around 21st century politics in ways that will probably solidify relations between Western powers that understand that they need to work together, and the sort of authoritarian axis, and with China and Russia, with Russia as the junior partner over the long haul, simply because Russia's economy is 10 times smaller than China's. And I think that's the sort of medium-term outlook that I see in global affairs over the next sort of 20 to 30 years.
Talking about aid, trucks full of aid are queuing up at the Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza, but Egypt won't open the crossing and let that aid in. At first, that seems counterintuitive for a country that's, clearly supports the Palestinian cause. Why is that happening?
Yeah, I think the Egyptians are very worried about destabilization. I think that many Palestinian groups are worried about what happens if people leave. I think there are also concerns about, on the Israeli side, about weapons coming in. I mean, it's obviously a very delicate issue. I think the Americans are going to make progress in pushing for this. And I suspect that one of the things that will come out of these summits is a much more detailed plan for humanitarian corridors. But I don't know. These things are changing so rapidly. By the time this airs, it's probably going to be quite different. But I think this is something that is a priority for the American government, and I do think there are ways to ensure that at least some of the avoidable catastrophes are avoided, and that is going to be the focus of a lot of Western diplomats over the coming days.
Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. This week, Claire Nurk, and apologies if I've mispronounced your surname, asks, following the deepfake of Keir Starmer, what do you think are the greatest risks in terms of AI and deepfakes in the upcoming elections on both sides of the Atlantic? Now, that deepfake, I think, purported to show Keir Starmer shouting at one of his staff, and it was fairly quickly debunked, but it was also pretty convincing. Rachel, are you worried about this?
I'm very worried about it, and I'm particularly worried about it having listened to one of Brian's podcasts on it a couple of years ago. Didn't you get a deep fake of yourself, or turn yourself into a deep fake? And it was really quite disturbing. The thing with this is that we're getting to the point where it is going to be virtually impossible to debunk very, very sophisticated, high-tech deep fakes. And we're just talking about misinformation and the media cycle, and how you get two different sets of reality and you can kind of pick your own. And I think the thing that worries me is less a specific example. I think we can all think of all kinds of existential horrific nightmare scenarios. But the idea that you will have a video and one side will say this is a deep fake and the other side will say no, this is real. We won't have the tools to be able to work out who's telling the truth and who's lying, certainly not as quickly as we need to for the discourse before it all moves on. And the sense of reality and truth will further splinter. And if you imagine that happening again and again and again, you will have people living in completely different realities that have a set of facts, and to just not be able to even have a conversation with their opponents because they're in different worlds there. And I also think on the sort of the flip side of it, it would be the existence of deepfake technology like this would make it very easy if a politician gets caught doing something that they have done but they shouldn't be, to just go, it's a deep fake, and to bluff it out, knowing that the debate will get so frenzied that the truth will never come out. So yes, I'm very worried about it.
Yeah, I worry particularly that people, even if it's shown to be a fake, and we have the people who are the subjects of the deep fake saying that it's a fake, then there will just be a kind of narrative in people's heads that go, yeah, but it's the kind of thing that person would say, isn't it? And it will kind of exist in their mind, and it will become part of their perception of that person, and the damage will have been done, even if it's successfully debunked. So, even all the efforts to verify that media organisations are trying to do, and to call out deep fakes as fast as possible, they could still fail. because people just don't want to know what the truth is, really.
And also, by verifying it, you draw attention to it. You get that image in more people's minds, but people who might not necessarily have seen it. And the more you talk about, is this video real or fake, the more likely it is that people will be exposed to it. But at the same time, you don't want to ignore it and leave something out there that has been invented on a computer.
Brian, are you even more worried than you were a few years ago?
Yeah, but in slightly different ways. I mean, I think when I wrote about deep fakes and when I've covered them on my podcast, it was sort of the big new thing. And I think the lesson in the intervening few years is actually that shallow fakes, which are very crudely edited, very stupidly done fake videos and photos, are good enough. I think the one thing that we sort of the deepfakes are a very serious problem, but I think it doesn't take that much actually to fool people. And that's the thing that I worry about. It's sort of like how, in the US political system, there was a lot of worries about Russian interference around elections. And that was obviously a very worthwhile worry. I mean, it was a serious problem. But then it turned out that a lot of homegrown actors were actually pumping this stuff in ways that were even more consequential through the right-wing media networks related to Fox News and Newsmax and so on, and then on social media. So it's sort of the most new form of disinformation, but we're going to be just absolutely flooded with it in a variety of ways. And it's not just going to be AI and deep fakes. I also think the other 2 points that I just make quickly. One is that, Elon Musk has started this thing of monetization on Twitter. And this basically just rewards clicks. So you have an amplification of people who have absolutely no skin in the game, but understand that if they get video views and clicks, they will make money. So there's now a very strong incentive for these bad actors online to just come up with innovative ways around elections and so on to generate content that will lead to more eyeballs seeing it. And finally, I think, there's something that's happening now with video and audio, which is what happened when Photoshop became widespread, a couple decades ago, where it's like, you just stop trusting images necessarily. You could just say, oh, it's Photoshopped. We used to be able to then say, okay, but we heard a recording or we watched a video. I suspect that what's just going to happen is at some point, we're all just going to be skeptical of everything we see and hear, which is precisely what, authoritarian governments try to do with their populations to make them more persuadable. And it's there's this line that Peter Pomerantsev, a disinformation expert, has where he says the title of his book is "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And I think we're heading towards that world where, if we all think nothing is true and everything is possible, then that choose your own reality doesn't require much sway. It just becomes the default. And we sort ourselves into camps based on our own set of facts, which is the breakdown of democracy, unfortunately. So there's my dose of optimism for today.
Yeah, you're right. It's straight out. It's in Hannah Arendt as well, isn't it? The idea that you want a population that doesn't trust anything, because then you can control them more easily because they're so distrustful they become scared. Donald Tusk is likely to become the next Prime Minister of Poland, and as long-time fans of the Tusker on this podcast, we're very happy about that. The Law and Justice Party has installed crony judges, taken over the media, and is now talking about trying to rerun the election. But the US president who tried to cling to power after he was kicked out in 2020 now has a real chance of running again and winning. That's despite the many felony indictments hanging over him. What would a Trump rerun mean for Europe, Ukraine, and indeed the Middle East? Brian, you argue that America needs to take the threat of a Trump comeback much more seriously. Are Democrats burying their heads in the sand?
I think that pretty much every Democrat is aware this is a serious risk. You just look at the polls, and the polls show either Trump ahead or very, very close with Biden. And so, lots can change. It's a little over a year until the election. But at the moment, it's looking like a toss-up. And the point of view that I have is that this would be, I think, a watershed moment in the history of the modern world, as well as, a serious death spiral for American democracy that is a realistic prospect. So it has to be taken really, really seriously. My worry is less with the Democrats themselves. It's more with how Trump is being portrayed in the media. And I wrote a piece a week ago, that coined this term called the banality of crazy. And it's sort of this notion that Trump's behavior has become so outlandish, but so routine that it no longer registers. And, after I wrote this piece criticizing the New York Times and other, American outlets for not covering some of Trump's rhetoric in which he, effectively, he called to execute America's top general. He called to shoot shoplifters on the spot without a trial, right, for minor crimes, to execute them. None of this got coverage. And yet, Joe Biden's dog biting a Secret Service agent had like hundreds of articles written about it in the U.S. press. And so after I, wrote this criticism and it took off online and people started to write about it in other mainstream outlets, the New York Times did cover this on page 14, right? They wrote about the sort of incitement to violence. And this is the thing that I think is really dangerous, is that we have an asymmetry where, like, yes, Joe Biden is old. Like, he absolutely is old. Trump is 3 years younger than him, but is also facing 91 felony indictments, was found liable for sexual abuse, incited an insurrection to overturn democracy, has been found recently to have committed mass fraud for self-enrichment, right? Like, these are not parallel things. They're not equivalent. And so to my mind, you have, a really big obligation on the part of the media to explain the magnitude of the story, not just the novelty. And I fear that a lot of the press in America has focused on novelty, which is why Joe Biden's dog, becomes a story. And it's particularly ironic because the whole aspect of media criticism around this is that's saying that, we don't cover dog bites man, we cover man bites dog stories. And yet the story about Biden was literally a dog bites man story. So, it's a complete mess. And the stuff Trump is saying on Truth Social, take my word for it, don't subject yourself to this. But the stuff he's saying on his own social media site is so much crazier than what he said as president. It's so much more extreme. He is amplifying QAnon constantly, and this is not getting covered. Whereas in 2017, when he said something like mildly weird, the BBC would call me to ask me about what had happened in US politics. This just doesn't happen anymore. It's just become baked in as part of the Trump equation.
What do we know about what he wants to do with a second term? Because his first term was often pretty chaotic. I mean, that was partly COVID, his people have reportedly been making much more detailed preparations this time. How easy will it be for them to push through the kind of changes that they want?
Yeah, so there's sort of two parallel stories here. On the one hand, Trump has no platform, right? Like he was literally asked in a softball interview by Sean Hannity, one of his big acolytes on Fox News, like, what would you do? And Trump didn't answer the question. He went on this long rant about how the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is out to get him and how awful Joe Biden is and so on. And Hannity just sort of moved on. And famously, in the 2020 election, normally the Republican National Committee will adopt a platform. And they didn't for the first time ever. They just basically said whatever Trump wants to do is what our platform is, which is sort of a perfect encapsulation of the personalization of the Republican Party around Trump. On the other hand, there is a series of people in the sort of pro-Trump intelligentsia, which is making preparations to dismantle what they call the deep state, but what we call the government. And the plans for this are quite scary. I mean, they're invoking arcane rules in which they would basically be able to amass executive power. There are plans on what to do in terms of what would happen if there's a contested election. This is particularly worrying if someone like Jim Jordan were to become Speaker of the House, because he was one of the main people who tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election through Congress. So if he's the Speaker, he could run the show, for this. So there's a lot of stuff under the surface that's really dangerous for U.S. democracy. On the global stage, my biggest worry is, it's a huge risk, is Trump could withdraw from NATO. And he talked about doing this in his first term, but was constrained by A, moderates in his party, and B, the threat of not getting reelected. The threat of not getting reelected is gone in term two. The moderates in his party do not exist. So, what I really worry about is Trump 2.0, I think, would be Trump unleashed, and it would be much more dangerous for the world. You think about what would happen in Ukraine. I mean, I think American aid would end. That's, I think, the answer. I think it would basically, he would stop authorizing it. So, a lot of really dangerous stuff, and it's depressing. It's monotonous because it's so relentless, but it has to be a major focus of geopolitics, because I think it is the greatest risk to world security in a very long time.
Do we know how he'd react to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Because he's not the biggest fan of China, or hasn't been in the past, although obviously his allegiances are flexible. But would he get involved?
It's very difficult to say. What I will say is that the one thing that Trump has been consistent on in his entire time in public life, and this goes back to the 1980s, is basically transactional bilateralism and a skepticism of international engagement to back other countries that don't do anything for us, as he would put it, right? So his viewpoint is that the only reason that the U.S. should do something is if it's in its own self-interest. Now, a lot of people would say backing Taiwan is in the geopolitical strategy of American foreign policy. Trump is very short-term, very transactional. And I think the biggest concern is the fact that we have to debate this is what would increase the risk of a Chinese invasion, because there'd be doubt, right? And that miscalculation is so important. The first Gulf War in Iraq was basically Saddam Hussein thinking that the U.S. wouldn't react, and he miscalculated. So if China does this and commits, we're in big trouble. And Biden has sent very clear signals on this front. So, I just think that there are so many unknowns that are playing with extremely dangerous risks that it truly is, in my view, the biggest risk that we faced in a long time.
Rachel, is Europe taking the prospect of a Trump comeback seriously?
I think it depends. What do you mean by take seriously? I think there is certainly real concern among European leaders that this is a realistic prospect in a way that there wasn't in 2016 when he was a joke candidate, and foreign ministries across Europe weren't really taking that seriously. I think one of the things that we've all learned about Trump over the last decade is there's always a possibility and you should be prepared for it. But okay, you think it might happen. What does that mean? What does preparing for that mean in practice? Brian just talked about the possibility of the US withdrawing from NATO. What does that look like? There's no real way that the remaining members of NATO could overnight make up the shortfall in US funding, US influence, US power. What would it look like in terms of who would lead the alliance? There's no sort of clear answers there. Kind of what would it mean for Ukraine to have Europe, which has been very united against Putin's Russia, suddenly, okay, Trump pulls US aid from Ukraine and perhaps says he's going to broker a deal between Putin and Ukraine. That puts Europe in an incredibly awkward position, and it's difficult to see a good option for how European leaders would react to that. And that's assuming that European leaders can agree with each other on what their reaction would be. I think we're already dealing with the consequences of US foreign policy during the first Trump term, which was pulling away from global institutions and global influence. And without getting too much into what's behind Putin's invasion of Russia, it's widely accepted that the US stepping back from global engagement during the Trump years was a factor in emboldening Putin. So I think the answer to that question is Europe is aware that it's a possibility, but there's a limit to what you can do to prepare for it.
And it's pretty blindsided at the moment by events, let's face it, in the last few years. The British Conservatives still have quite strong links to the Republicans. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have both visited them recently, but the Labour Party doesn't. Do we have a sense of what Keir Starmer's foreign policy priorities are? I mean, events, but do we know how he'd handle this scenario?
Not really. I mean, up until the last couple of weeks, we didn't have a sense of Labour's policy on anything, foreign or domestic. And then we had Labour Party conference, and obviously the focus was very much on the Middle East there. I think if you look at what David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been saying, his main thrust of foreign policy under Labour is very much to do with closer alignment and a closer relationship with Europe, not rejoining the EU, but of rebuilding relationships on that front. But I think Labour would struggle with the Trump presidency, as all governments will, and particularly all governments on the left. One thing that I think is sort of worth pointing out when you look at the Conservative links to Trump, it's very overdone, I think, to compare Boris Johnson to Donald Trump. And I think there are orders of magnitude apart. But one of the things that the Conservative Party, and perhaps, we don't know, British politics learned during the Boris Johnson years, was that you can try the Trump playbook and you can try to just flat out lie and deny things, and sometimes you will actually get away with it, and sometimes you can break the accepted norms of politics in your country, whether that's to do with who pays for what or how you go about with accountability and issues of transparency. And for a very long time, it will work. Now, in the end, for Boris Johnson, it didn't work. But I do worry that some in British politics have learnt the wrong lessons from the Trump presidency, and that is quite worrying.
Starmer talked last week in his speech at the conference about an age of uncertainty, which is a phrase that's used a lot now. What would a Europe without the US on our side and a Ukraine potentially defeated by Russia feel like? How would it change?
It might feel like the 1930s, actually, with a United States which was in some kind of isolation, didn't want to get involved, and so on. There are some who think that a Trump second presidency would mean the end of American democracy, at least as we have come to know it, and it would be very, very difficult to handle. I mean, he is, after all, one of the things that's still astounding, and it picks up both Brian and Rachel's point, is that he is, in a sense, the world's number one shallow fake. I mean, we know he's a fake successful businessman. We know how much he inherited. We know he's sort of a fake traditional Republican or conservative because he's so radical. And yet he still has a constituency among about half of American voters. So it will be very, very difficult to navigate a second Trump presidency because perhaps he doesn't even know, even though Brian says there's some planning going on, he doesn't know what he might actually do from day to day. I should say that I remember an American diplomat saying to me when he was reflecting on how Clinton and John Major didn't get on very well years ago. And he said to me, but you see, in general, the British Prime Minister and the American President are always fated to get along. And that has been the story since 1945, or actually before that, since the Second World War. I'm not sure that would be true now. Starmer may very well, if he becomes Prime Minister and Trump becomes President of the United States, think that he has got some access to and ability to shift Donald Trump. But I don't think that's likely, frankly.
It would be the end of any pretense of the special relationship.
Well, I never believe there is the special relationship anyway. I think America's got a special relationship with so many countries, including Israel and Japan and Mexico and so on. So the special relationship is a British fantasy, which, again, an American diplomat once said to me, we always mention that in order to tickle the belly of the Brits. So our belly has been tickled, but I don't think Trump is a tickler, at least not of political bellies. There may be other ones.
Brian, Joe Biden's candidacy looks a given. Robert F. Kennedy said last week he'd run as an independent. What is his platform apart from quite a lot of vaccine skepticism?
Well, he has a platform on the sort of standard things that, presidential candidates have a platform on: housing and education, all that type of stuff. What voters see him as is the sort of anti-vax conspiracist. And interestingly, some of his platform is actually very, very right-wing. So he backs a national abortion ban, for example, after a certain period. And these aspects of his candidacy are much more aligned with traditional Republican voters. It's unclear, I think, still what would happen if there was a three-party or three-person race. The conventional wisdom often is, especially on the left, is, well, these would be spoiler candidates, and they would end up increasing the likelihood that Trump could win in some places that he normally wouldn't if it was a head-to-head Biden-Trump matchup. With RFK, I don't know. I mean, he's such a fringe candidate where he really does not poll well among the Democrats, who are, very, very pro-science for the most part as a party, that I did see one preliminary poll yesterday that showed Biden with a 9-point lead over Trump when RFK was put in the mix. And RFK was mostly pulling from Trump. Whether that's an outlier, whether that's going to be indicative, I don't know. I think most voters know very little about him, to be honest. I think that he's not a household name, other than the fact that he's a Kennedy, which they know that. But I don't think they know much about his policies, his platforms, et cetera. And the more that this becomes clear, some of this conspiracist stuff that he talks about, I think the more it's going to be a turnoff to traditional Democratic voters. There's been a splintering on this, right, in the last sort of 7-8 years, because of the way that Trump responded to the pandemic. Democrats became much more pro-vaccine and Republicans became much more anti-vaccine, and in a way that just didn't happen in Europe, not nearly to the degree. So much so, by the way, that the demographics of deaths in the U.S. are highly tied to partisanship. A lot more Republicans died because they basically didn't, in the sort of Delta wave beyond after the vaccination became a possibility for most people, because they just simply didn't take it. And so those voters, I think, are more likely to be RFK's bastion. But how much he gets, I don't know. I mean, most of the time in the U.S., you only have 5% for a third party. There's exceptions like in the early 1990s with Ross Perot, but most of the time it's candidates that take away 5-7%, and then you sort of shake out based on who they're pulling away from, and we still don't know who that will be.
We've reached the end of the show, so what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Rachel?
I've had a really depressing week, as I think many of us have. And so my under the radar story is that the Guinness World Record for the cat with the loudest purr has been broken by a 14-year-old cat from Cambridgeshire called Bella, who had an official world record attempt. And I've seen the video. If you're interested in the video, it's mostly an advert for Whiskas cat food, but I still think it's worth watching anyway, where the official Guinness World Record adjudicator turns up and with a decibel reader, whatever you call the sound things, measures the volume of Bella's purr, 54.6 decibels, equivalent to the volume of a boiling kettle. And just well done, Bella.
Well, I think we all needed that, frankly, after Middle East war and Trump. So thank you. My under the radar is that nitrous oxide is being banned from November. So if you're taking it, you should stop taking it. And especially you should stop taking it because you get a couple of years in jail if you take it. And if you deal it, you get up to 14 years in jail, which, given that the British prisons are already overcrowded, and in fact they're having to pop up tents in jail yards and try and get rid of prisoners early who are violent and really shouldn't be released. It is remarkable to think that there will be space for all these nitrous oxide offenders, but hey, priorities.
Especially because the main reason, the justification for it is not that it's particularly bad for you, because it isn't really, but litter. They're concerned about litter. And
14 years for contributing to litter. It hits home, doesn't it? But then, once smoking is banned, what are we going to have left, really? There's not really... Anyway, Gavin.
This podcast.
Yes. Gavin, what have you got for us?
Oh, I've got absolutely breaking news that a reptile rescue and rehoming centre in Kent has reported a large influx of animals due to the cost of living crisis. People who have reptiles are finding they're too expensive to keep, and they're taking their reptiles along to the National Centre for Reptile Welfare in Tunbridge, Kent. So there sounds to me like a place to put your charity money and keep the lizards safe.
Can we adopt some of these abandoned crocodiles if we want to?
I think you could adopt I think probably they would want to. They're trying to raise £100,000 to expand their facilities. So if you've got a snake, a lizard, or a tortoise, or you want to have a snake, a lizard, or a tortoise, that's the place to go. Tunbridge in Kent.
At the moment, I don't feel like owning a snake is my priority. Plus, I'm not sure that it would get on with our cat at all.
But how loud is your cat's purr, out of interest?
Depends if she's in a good mood. I mean, it can be almost non-existent occasionally, but it can also be quite loud. But I don't think that's the main problem, to be honest. I think it's more that she's a hunter and she'd end up being killed by the snake because she's quite a small cat. Anyway, we need to get serious. Brian, what have you got for us?
I have a slightly different one. One of the things I've been looking, like Rachel has, for sort of something uplifting in the news. And the way I've chosen to come about this is to think what the news doesn't cover is really positive long-term trends that we lose sight of because the news focuses on headlines of events. And so one of the things I've been looking at is extreme poverty in the world. And in 1975, half of the world population lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is 8%. And I think we lose sight of some of these really big sort of trends that really do transform lots of people's lives when we're doom scrolling through lots of horrific stuff that we can do stuff about. But, it doesn't make a good headline to say extreme poverty reduced by 0.1% today. But it is the big news story, I think, that we're missing.
Thank you, Brian. And that's the show. Thanks to Gavin.
Thank you very much.
Rachel.
Thank you.
And Brian.
Thank you.
Brian's new book, Fluke, Chance, Chaos and Why Everything We Do Matters, is out in the UK on 1st of February 2024. Stay tuned for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and the traditional thank you to our army of generous supporters. You too could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how to get yours. We'll see you next time.